I was grabbing coffee with a senior safety inspector last Tuesday, a man who has spent 30 years obsessing over the structural integrity of wing spars.
Okay.
But he wasn't talking about rivets. He was showing me a glossy brochure for his airline's new Emotional Intelligence and Engineering initiative. He was uncharacteristically animated, telling me how they'd finally decentered the rigid, old-school checklist culture in favor of holistic team synergy.
Holistic team synergy.
Yeah. He seemed convinced that by fixing the vibe of the maintenance floor, the planes would somehow take care of themselves. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "We're finally prioritizing the pilot's humanity over the machine's coldness."
That's a powerful statement.
It is. But the reversal came when I mentioned the flurry of landing gear failures that hit the FAA logs between January 13th and 15th. I asked if the synergy had caught the microfractures in those Colorado incidents.
And his reaction?
His demeanor shifted instantly. He didn't get defensive, he got dismissive. He waved his hand as if I'd brought up a triviality, a technical distraction from their cultural progress. He actually said, "Those are just isolated technical anomalies. If we obsess over every bolt, we lose sight of the mission."
Wow. From a safety inspector, a man whose entire job is to obsess over every bolt.
Exactly. It was this jarring moment of cognitive dissonance. Here was a man whose career was built on the premise that a single loose bolt can kill hundreds, suddenly treating physical reality like a nuisance that was getting in the way of his department's diversity scorecard. That split-second transition from a safety expert to an ideological gatekeeper is the sound of a system in terminal decline. It suggests that we are no longer living in a world governed by engineering excellence, but in one where we've decided that if the ideology is right, the laws of gravity will simply have to cooperate.
But they don't.
But as we are beginning to see, physics does not negotiate, and the fasteners of our civilization are starting to shear off.
It is a profound and, frankly, unsettling observation to start with. And, listening to that, what really strikes me isn't just the dismissiveness of the inspector, it's the date you mentioned.
January 23, 2026.
Exactly. We're sitting here right now looking at this landscape in the aviation industry that just seems to be buckling under the weight of two completely opposing forces.
Right, and that's the whole mission for this deep dive today. We're trying to really understand that collision. On one side, you have the unforgiving, immutable laws of physics, gravity, drag, metal fatigue, the things that will kill you if you get them wrong.
The things that don't care about your feelings or your corporate mission statement.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And on the other side, you have this massive surge of social dogma and administrative theory that basically says we can reshape reality if we just, use the right language and have the right intentions.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. And just to be clear for everyone listening, we aren't just riffing on this one anecdote to really figure out if this is a systemic issue or, just one guy having a bad day over coffee. We have pulled together a massive stack of documentation.
A huge stack.
We have the actual incident reports from earlier this month on those landing gear failures you mentioned. We've got historical case studies on Boeing's decline from the Harvard Law and Business Reviews.
We also have a highly controversial quantitative study from 2025 by an academic named Emre Kuvvet, and it's all about safety outcomes.
And on top of that, regulatory theory from Leiden University, which gets into the nitty-gritty of how the watchdogs stop watching.
Plus, and I think this is key, we have some leaked internal narratives, firsthand accounts from engineers, from pilots, that give us a window into what's actually happening behind the security badge readers at these companies.
It's a lot to get through, but I think the central theme here, the sort of high-level view that all these sources point toward, is this concept of the High Reliability Organization, or HRO.
Okay, let's define that before we jump in, because that's a term that might be new to some people. What makes an organization high reliability?
So in, academic theory, an HRO is an organization that has to operate in a super high-stakes environment where any error can be catastrophic. Think nuclear power plants, air traffic control, aircraft carriers.
Right, places where you can't have an oops moment.
Exactly. And these organizations are defined by a very specific culture. The number one trait is a preoccupation with failure. They obsess over the tiniest anomaly. If a gauge reads 0.1% off, they don't just note it down, they shut everything down to find out why.
So paranoia is actually a virtue in an HRO. It's a feature, not a bug.
Productive paranoia, precisely.
Yeah.
But the argument that's presented in all of our source material today is that we are witnessing the systematic dismantling of that very culture. We're seeing a fundamental shift from a preoccupation with failure to a preoccupation with social engineering, and administrative process.
So the sources are arguing that we've essentially replaced the obsession with safety with an obsession with ideology.
That's the core thesis we're going to explore.
Okay, so let's test that hypothesis. If we're going to diagnose this rot, as some of the sources actually call it, we have to go back to what feels like patient zero of modern aviation struggles, Boeing.
Right. And to understand Boeing in 2026, you can't just look at what happened last year or the year before. You have to look at the history. For something like 80 years, Boeing was, for all intents and purposes, an engineering association that happened to sell planes.
I remember the old joke in Seattle was that they would build the perfect plane even if it bankrupted them.
That was the culture. If it's not Boeing, I'm not going. That wasn't just a marketing slogan. It was a belief system rooted in engineering pride.
It meant something.
It did. But the sources all point to a very specific date where the timeline diverges, where the culture begins to fracture. 1997, the merger with McDonnell Douglas.
I feel like this gets mentioned a lot in, business school case studies, but let's actually unpack what happened there. Because it wasn't just two companies shaking hands and combining letterhead.
No, not at all. It was a cultural takeover. The source material from the Harvard Business Review breaks this down in fascinating and pretty brutal detail. Boeing was the engineering giant, but McDonnell Douglas was the, let's say, financial operator. When they merged, the McDonnell Douglas executives, led by a guy named Harry Stonecipher, they essentially took the reins.
And their philosophy was just fundamentally different.
Radically different. There's a famous quote attributed to the new leadership at the time. "We are going to stop hiring people to be a family and start hiring people to be a team." Which, on the surface sounds like a standard corporate memo.
Right, sounds fine.
But the subtext was crystal clear. We don't care about your legacy or your engineering pride. We care about the quarterly earnings report. We care about the stock price. That is the new god here.
The sources talk a lot about the physical move of the headquarters, right? They moved from Seattle, the heart of their manufacturing, all the way to Chicago. Why does that matter? I mean, it's just an office building.
It matters immensely for the culture. It was a deeply symbolic and practical decision. When the HQ was in Seattle, the executives could literally walk out of their offices and onto the factory floor. They could smell the jet fuel. They could see the rivets being driven.
You were connected to the physical reality of what they were making.
Yes. If an engineer had a problem, the CEO was physically present in that same world. By moving the executive suite to a skyscraper in Chicago, they deliberately severed that link. The analysis in the sources is that they wanted to separate the clean, abstract business of selling stock from the messy, greasy, complicated reality of building airplanes.
So you end up with two different companies under one name. You have the suits in a tower in Chicago looking at spreadsheets, and you have the graybeards in Seattle looking at blueprints, and they eventually just stop speaking the same language.
That is the argument, precisely. And this created a power vacuum. In the old days, the engineering safety logic was dominant. If a senior engineer stood up and said, "This wing isn't ready," the discussion was over. The plane didn't fly, period.
Engineering had the final say.
It had veto power. Post-1997, that engineering authority was systematically eroded. It was replaced by financial authority. So the conversation changes. "The wing isn't ready," the manager says. "Well, how much will it cost to delay the delivery? What's the hit to the quarterly numbers? Can we fix it in post-production? Can we issue a service bulletin later?"
Which leads us directly, almost inevitably, to the 737 MX. We have to talk about this because it really is the precursor to everything we're seeing in 2026.
It is the smoking gun of this cultural shift. The 2018 and 2019 crashes Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 killed 346 people. But the cause wasn't just a bad part or a single mistake. It was a workaround born of this new culture.
The MCAS.
The Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. It sounds so technical, but the story behind it is it's a story about finance versus physics.
But break it down for us. What was the core problem they were trying to solve?
So Boeing's main competitor, Airbus, came out with their new A320neo, which had these super fuel-efficient engines. Boeing was caught flat-footed. They needed to compete fast. Their solution was to put bigger, more efficient engines on their cash cow, the 737.
But the 737 is an old design.
A very old design. It was designed in the 60s, and it sits very low to the ground. So to fit these massive new engines under the wing, they had to mount them further forward and higher up.
Which changes the whole physics of how the plane flies.
Exactly. It completely changed the center of gravity and the aerodynamics. Under certain conditions, especially with high power on takeoff, the nose of the plane had a tendency to pitch up. If it pitches up too much, the wings lose lift, you stall, and you fall out of the sky.
So the engineering solution would be a total redesign of the airframe.
Which would have cost billions of dollars and taken years. It would mean admitting the 737 had reached the end of its life. But from the Chicago skyscraper, that was unacceptable, so they came up with a shortcut.
A software patch for a hardware problem?
That's the perfect way to put it. They wrote a piece of software called MCAS. If a single tiny sensor on the outside of the plane detected the nose was getting too high, the software would automatically and very aggressively push the nose back down.
And crucially, they didn't tell the pilots about it.
That's the part that is just so damning. They hid its existence. The HBR articles we reviewed are clear on this. They didn't want to tell the pilots because if it was a new system that could take control of the aircraft, it would trigger a requirement for new, expensive simulator training for pilots.
And the airlines wouldn't want to buy a plane that costs a fortune to train their pilots on.
So to sell the plane, the sales pitch had to be no new simulator training required. It was a financial decision that directly led to them hiding a critical flight control system from the very people who needed to know about it.
And then we saw those internal messages that came out during the congressional investigation. I remember reading them and just being floored. This airplane is designed by clowns, who in turn are supervised by monkeys.
That one phrase tells you everything you need to know about the collapse of a high-reliability organization. In a healthy HRO, you respect your colleagues' expertise, even when you disagree. In that post-merger culture at Boeing, it was clear the engineers, the clowns in this context, or maybe the ones calling management the clowns, were completely demoralized.
Yeah.
They knew they were being forced to ship a flawed, dangerous product.
But hold on, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. That was years ago now. The argument from the industry and from Boeing itself is that they fixed this. They fired the CEO, they paid massive fines, they brought in David Calhoun. Wasn't he supposed to be the turnaround artist?
That was certainly the narrative that was pushed. But the sources we're looking at today suggest Calhoun was just a continuation of the same philosophy, maybe even a doubling down. He was a protege of Jack Welch at GE.
Neutron Jack.
The very same. The Jack Welch style of management is all about ruthless efficiency, financialization, shareholder value above all else, and cutting what he called fat. The problem is, in the world of aviation, sometimes the fat is your safety margin.
So instead of a deep cultural overhaul, what did we get?
We got whack-a-mole, that's the term one of the analysts uses. When the door plug blew out on that Alaska Airlines flight in 2024, the leadership immediately framed it as an isolated manufacturing defect.
Someone forgot to put the bolts in.
Right. A one-off. They didn't ask the deeper question. Why did the system, the culture, and the quality control processes allow a plane to leave the factory with critical bolts missing? They treated the symptom, not the disease.
And this brings us to the enablers of this whole situation. Because Boeing doesn't operate in a vacuum. They are supposed to be heavily regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. And the sources we have here are, well, they're pretty damning about the FAA's role in all of this.
This is where we have to get into the weeds of regulatory capture. We have a really interesting thesis here from Leiden University that applies what's known as Dalbo's framework to the FAA. It's a bit academic, but the mechanism it describes is absolutely fascinating.
So let's start with the acronym we hear all the time, ODA, Organization Designation Authorization. What is that?
It sounds incredibly boring, but it is the critical mechanism of failure. Historically, the FAA had its own engineers and inspectors, and they inspected the planes. But as planes got more and more complex, and as government budgets got squeezed over the decades, the FAA made an argument.
What was the argument?
They essentially said they couldn't afford to hire enough experts to check every single wire and line of code on a modern jet like the 787. It was too complex.
So they outsourced their job?
In a way, yes. They created the ODA program. This program allows Boeing to appoint its own employees to act as official representatives of the FAA.
Wait. Let me get this straight. The person who inspects the work and signs off on it for the government is on the payroll of the company that's doing the work.
That's it. You're an engineer. Your badge says Boeing. Your paycheck comes from Boeing. Your manager, who determines your bonus and your promotion, is a Boeing manager whose primary goal is to get the plane out the door on schedule. But you have a special stamp that says, today, you're acting on behalf of the FAA.
That seems like an absolutely impossible conflict of interest.
It is. If you raise a safety concern and refuse to stamp the paperwork, you are not just being a good regulator. You are delaying your boss's project and hurting your own career prospects within the company that pays you. The pressure to sign is immense.
So it's the classic fox guarding the henhouse problem.
It's the definition of it. And the Leiden thesis argues this leads to what's called cultural capture. Over time, the FAA stops seeing itself as the policeman on the beat and starts thinking of itself as a partner to the industry. They start to share the industry's values like efficiency and speed to market.
And they become dependent on the company for information.
That's the other key part, what the theory calls information asymmetry. The manufacturer, Boeing, knows infinitely more about the plane than the regulator does. The FAA comes to depend on Boeing to tell them what to even look at.
So the regulator is essentially flying blind, just trusting the company to report its own problems.
And when the culture at the company begins to rot, as we saw with the MCAS, the regulator is the last to know. The thesis describes the FAA's attempts at reform after the MAX crashes as single-loop learning.
What does that mean?
It means they fix the specific identified error, they fix the MCAS software, they mandate a new training protocol. But they never engage in double-loop learning, which would mean questioning the fundamental values and structure of the system itself. They never question the ODA program that allowed the problem to happen in the first place.
So we have a weakened, captured regulator and a thoroughly financialized manufacturer. That's the baseline reality. But now, here in 2026, the sources we're looking at argue we have added a powerful new variable into this already dangerous mix. We've added ideology.
This is where the discussion really shifts from, let's say, traditional 20th century corporate greed into something very distinct to our current era. The central argument is that critical resources, time, money, and most importantly, the cognitive focus of the engineering workforce are being actively diverted away from technical excellence and toward social engineering.
And we're not just talking about, a mandatory HR seminar once a year. The claim is that this is impacting core engineering resources. And this is where I want to bring in our first major story. This comes from a whistleblower report that was posted on a tech forum, Observing the Aerospace Industry in Early 2026. It's about a senior engineer named Elias.
Okay, sure.
I'm going to read this carefully because the specific details really matter here. I saw a whistleblower report on a tech forum recently that really makes you question what's happening behind the glass doors of our major aerospace giants.
Right.
It followed a man named Elias, a senior structural engineer with 25 years of experience, who found himself sitting in a sleek, minimalist office in Seattle in early 2026. He wasn't looking at blueprints, he was staring at a social impact compliance dashboard.
Okay, compliance dashboard, not a stress test result.
No. And then it says, Elias had discovered a harmonic resonance issue in a new wing spar design, the kind of technical glitch that eventually leads to metal fatigue.
Can we just pause there for a second? Harmonic resonance. That sounds like technical jargon, but that is a terrifying phrase to an engineer.
Explain what it actually means in the context of a wing.
So everything in the physical world has a natural frequency at which it wants to vibrate. Think about pushing a child on a swing. You push at just the right rhythm, and the swing goes higher and higher. That's resonance. Now imagine the wind flowing over a wing or the vibration from a jet engine hitting the natural frequency of the wing spar itself.
The wing starts to hum.
It starts to hum, and then it starts to vibrate more and more violently. It's the same principle as an opera singer shattering a wine glass with their voice. If a wing spar has a harmonic resonance issue, it means that under certain completely normal flight conditions, the very structure of the wing could literally shake itself apart over time or develop microfractures metal fatigue much, much faster than any of the design models predicted.
So this is a plane falls out of the sky kind of problem.
This is a fundamental, catastrophic design flaw. It's the kind of thing you stop everything to fix.
Okay, so Elias, the 25-year veteran, finds this potential catastrophe. Let's see what happens next in the story. Quote, but when he requested a budget for additional stress testing, he was told the funds had been diverted to the new Department of Corporate Culture and Equity Integration.
Wow.
His manager, a man with an MBA but no engineering background, explained that the administrative overhead for the quarterly diversity audit took priority over discretionary testing.
Discretionary testing. Stress testing a wing is now discretionary.
That's what he was told. Elias watched as his team of elite engineers spent 40% of their week in workshops on deconstructing technical hierarchy instead of refining the CAD models.
40%. 2 full days out of a 5-day work week.
By the time the project reached the prototype stage, the engineering margin, that invisible cushion of safety, had been thinned out to pay for the very bureaucracy that was supposed to make the company better.
Unbelievable.
The person who wrote the report concludes with this. I read this and felt a cold shiver. As someone who covers industry trends, I understand the desire for a more inclusive workplace. It's a noble goal that we should all strive for. But looking at Elias's situation, you have to wonder if we've created a tax on safety. When administrative bloat starts eating the resources meant for technical excellence, the cost isn't just financial, it's structural. We want progress, but we cannot afford to trade the laws of physics for the laws of bureaucracy.
That concept, the tax on safety, that is the absolute crux of the argument being made in these sources.
But, a skeptic might listen to this and say, come on, a massive multi-billion-dollar company like Boeing or Airbus surely has enough money for both, right? Can't they do their diversity audits and do the stress testing?
In theory, on a spreadsheet, yes. But in the real world of projects and deadlines, budgets are finite. And even more importantly, as the story highlights, time and focus are finite.
The 40% number.
That 40% number is the killer. We need to talk about cognitive load. Engineering, real deep engineering work, isn't something you can just pick up and put down for an hour between meetings. It requires long periods of sustained, uninterrupted focus, a flow state.
Right.
If you are constantly being pulled out of that deep work to attend workshops on, what was the phrase, deconstructing technical hierarchy, you aren't just losing those hours, you are losing the entire day because your mental momentum is broken. You can't solve complex physics problems in 15-minute increments.
And the irony of deconstructing technical hierarchy in a field like aviation, isn't a clear hierarchy of competence absolutely necessary for safety?
It's essential. In a safety-critical field, you want a hierarchy of competence. You want the person who knows the most about harmonic resonance to be the one whose voice carries the most weight, regardless of their title or social identity. If you start to deconstruct that because it feels socially unequal or non-inclusive, you are actively removing the safety filter from the system.
And the story also points out the new incentive structure. If Elias fights tooth and nail for the testing money, he risks being labeled as a troublemaker or someone who is resistant to change.
Whereas if he just shuts up and goes to the workshop and fills out the compliance form, he's a good employee and a team player. It creates what one source called the tyranny of the mediocre. The path of least resistance for everyone involved is to just ignore the looming technical risk and focus on the immediate social compliance demands.
And that is how you end up with a wing that vibrates itself apart 5 years down the road, and everyone acts surprised.
Exactly.
Now, the story of Elias is one story.
Yeah.
And a skeptic could rightly say, okay, that's a powerful anecdote, but it's just an anecdote. Maybe Elias is just a bitter employee, or this is an isolated case. But we have data that attempts to quantify this exact phenomenon. And we have to talk about the Cuvette study from 2025.
This is where the conversation gets very, very thorny because the findings are so stark. This is an academic study by Cuvette, published in Academic Questions, and it's titled Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives, a study of the effects on workplace safety and customer satisfaction.
And we should be absolutely clear. This study is controversial. Its conclusions are heavily debated. But we're here to look at what the data in the source actually says.
And Cuvette performed a quantitative analysis. He didn't interview people about their feelings. He looked at the hard numbers. He analyzed the correlation between a company's diversity score, which is a real metric that investors and ratings agencies use to score how committed a company is to DEI policies, and their actual reported safety outcomes.
So what were the findings? What was the correlation?
The correlation was strong and positive in the statistical sense, meaning as one number went up, the other number went up too.
So as the diversity score went up,
workplace accidents went up. He found that increasing a company's diversity score from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile, so going from a low performer to a high performer on DEI metrics, was associated with a 52.9% rise in total reported workplace accidents.
52.9%. That is not a margin of error. That's a massive, massive spike.
It's a huge number. And he found a similar but negative correlation with customer satisfaction. The higher the diversity score, the lower the customer satisfaction rating. And he also found that higher scores correlated with an increase in health and safety-related controversies.
Okay, the first rule of statistics is that correlation is not causation. We know that. Did the study propose a mechanism? Did Cuvette have a theory for why a company focusing on diversity would have more accidents?
He proposed two main mechanisms. The first is what you could call a competence trade-off. The argument is that if a company's management is under intense pressure from their board, from investors, from the public to meet specific demographic targets, if their annual bonuses literally depend on hitting these quotas, They may be incentivized to overlook essential qualifications or experience levels for safety-sensitive positions in order to meet the demographic target.
So, if you have two candidates for a critical role, and one is a slightly better engineer, but the other helps you hit a hiring target.
The pressure, both subtle and explicit, is to hire the one who helps meet the target. The second mechanism is simpler. It's the distraction hypothesis we just saw with Elias.
The tax on safety.
Tax on safety, cognitive load. If the C-suite and senior management are spending a huge amount of their time, energy, and resources focused on the diversity audit, they are, by definition, spending less time, energy, and resources focused on the safety audit. It's a zero-sum game of attention.
This reminds me of some of the other source materials we looked at, specifically those Reddit archives from a thread called Workplace Revolutionaries. There was this concept that kept coming out, the idea of a paper reality versus the physical reality.
That's a great way to frame it. The paper reality is all the reports, the dashboards, the compliance statements, the ESG scores. In that paper reality, the company is doing great because they met their diversity goals and got a high score. Everything looks perfect.
But in the physical reality, down on the factory floor where planes are actually being built, the competence is eroding and things are starting to break.
Right. And one of the anecdotes in that thread that really stuck with me was about the Havel's greengrocer effect. Can you explain that concept?
Yeah, it's a reference to Václav Havel, the Czech dissident who later became president. He wrote this brilliant essay about a greengrocer living under the communist regime in Czechoslovakia. And every day, the greengrocer puts a little sign in his shop window with the slogan, "Workers of the world, unite."
Does he believe it?
No. Havel's point is that he almost certainly doesn't believe it. He might even privately hate it. But he puts the sign there to signal to the authorities, "I am obedient, I am compliant, please leave me alone." It's an act of public conformity to survive.
So in the corporate context of 2026, the slogan is participating in the performative workshop.
Exactly. Employees nod along with initiatives they privately know are absurd. And the Reddit thread had examples like DEI training that involved basket weaving or professionally segregated affinity groups because they want to keep their jobs and be seen as good team players. But this creates a pervasive culture of dishonesty.
If you get used to lying about the small things every day,
You'll eventually lie about the big things. Exactly. If you train your entire workforce to suppress their critical thinking in a meeting about microaggressions just to survive socially, are you really creating an environment where that same employee will feel empowered to stand up and say, "Wait, I see a technical error in this blueprint that's going to delay the entire project"?
No, the culture of conformity completely swallows the culture of safety. The muscle of dissent atrophies.
Which brings us from the maintenance floor and the engineering bays to the most critical environment of all, the cockpit. We've talked about the engineers who design the planes and the mechanics who fix them, but ultimately someone has to fly the machine. And this next story we have, this one is heavy.
This is the story about the trainee pilot, Julian.
Yeah. This comes directly from a training captain at a major European flight academy. I'm going to share this, and I really want us to analyze the implications of every part of it.
Okay.
I heard a story from a training captain at a major European flight academy, someone who has seen the transition into this 2026 reality firsthand. She spoke about a young trainee named Julian. Under the new Future Skies initiative, Julian was fast-tracked into the cockpit of a long-haul jet. Julian was bright and met every identity-based metric the airline's HR department had set to achieve their 2026 representative excellence goals.
Okay, so he ticked all the boxes on paper.
All the HR boxes. However, during a high-stress simulator session involving a dual-engine flameout, Julian froze.
Let's just stop right there. Froze. In a dual-engine flame-out scenario, especially at altitude, you have mere seconds to perform critical memory items. You have to establish best glide speed. You have to begin the restart procedure. Freezing is not an option. Freezing is fatal.
And in a normal training environment, that's a washout, right? I mean, if you freeze in the sim during a critical failure, you do not get to fly the real jet.
In any merit-based system, absolutely. That is the filter. The simulator is designed to be brutal, specifically to weed out the people who can't handle that level of stress. It's a brutal process, but it's what keeps hundreds of passengers alive on every flight.
But listen to what happened next in this account. He lacked the gut feeling, the instinct that comes from thousands of hours of grueling merit-based weeding out. The instructor, a captain named Sarah, wanted to fail him, but she was pulled aside by an HR consultant.
An HR consultant in a flight simulator debrief?
Yes, who reminded her that her own promotion trajectory depended on the success rate of this specific cohort of trainees.
Oh, no.
The meritocracy that once acted as a brutal but necessary filter had been replaced by a quota system that prioritized the appearance of progress over the reality of proficiency. Sarah signed the papers, but she told her colleagues she would never let her own family fly on a plane where Julian was the first officer.
That is bone-chilling. Sarah signed the papers.
She compromised her professional integrity because the system pressured her because her own career was on the line.
Right, and the account continues. This story is incredibly difficult to process. On one hand, opening doors for people who are historically excluded is how we grow as a society. But on the other hand, high-stakes environments like aviation are zero-error zones.
When I look at this through my lens as a commentator, I see the human tragedy on both sides. A young man placed in a position he wasn't ready for, and an instructor forced to compromise her integrity. We have to find a way to champion diversity without dismantling the rigors of technical merit, because at 30,000 feet, the only thing that matters is if the person at the controls can bring the plane home.
This story just brings that paper reality concept into life or death focus. In the paper reality, Julian is a massive success story. He's a statistic that proves the Future Skies initiative is working. He helps the airline meet its representative excellence goal.
The spreadsheet looks great.
The spreadsheet looks fantastic, but in the physical reality of a dark cockpit over the Atlantic with 2 failed engines, he is a danger to himself and 300 passengers.
And this story connects directly to the public controversy that erupted around United Airlines back in January of 2025. The CEO, Scott Kirby, was very vocal about this.
He was trying to walk a very fine line. He went on TV and insisted that United would only ever hire on merit. But in the same breath, he was defending their aggressive DEI policies and stating that a diverse workforce is, by its very nature, the best of the best.
But critics, and we saw prominent figures like Elon Musk and Jordan Peterson jump all over this, they immediately pointed out what they saw as a fundamental mathematical contradiction.
What was the contradiction they highlighted?
They argued that if you have a true, strict meritocracy, you just take the top 1% of applicants based on test scores and performance, regardless of their demographic background. The pool is what it is. But the moment you introduce a demographic target or a quota, you are, by definition, potentially having to skip over to the person with the highest score to pick someone further down the list who fits the demographic target you need to meet.
This is what some of the sources call the identity matrix problem. The way hiring works in these systems is that it's moved away from a simple percentage-based meritocracy. Your flight simulator score is 98, his is 96. You get the job to a complex matrix where things like lived experience or specific identity markers are given point values that are added to the technical score.
So in this system, Julian might have had lower scores in the simulator, but his overall matrix score could have been higher because he fulfilled other criteria set by HR.
That's exactly the argument. And the most sinister part of that story is the HR consultant telling Sarah, the instructor, that her promotion depended on his passing. That is the enforcement mechanism. It's designed to corrupt the gatekeepers. Sarah is no longer functioning as a safety barrier. She's been turned into a rubber stamp for an HR initiative.
And it's not just the pilots in the cockpit. It's the people who are supposed to be keeping the planes airworthy, the mechanics on the ground. This leads to our third and final story, which I think is perhaps the most haunting because it's about the loss of something you can't get back easily. Institutional memory.
This is the Arthur story, the graybeard.
Yes, this one really paints a vivid picture of what we stand to lose as a society. Try to imagine you are standing in a maintenance hangar in London. It's a rainy Tuesday in 2026, and the ghost in the machine is starting to wake up. There's a mechanic named Arthur, one of the last graybeards who knows the sound of a failing turbine just by standing near it.
That's not an exaggeration. That's a real skill.
It's real. He's watching a new team of technicians struggle with a standard engine overhaul. These technicians are the products of a revamped educational system that prioritized socially conscious engineering over mechanical proficiency. They could explain the socio-political implications of resource extraction, but they struggle to calibrate a torque wrench to the required precision without a digital prompt.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, a torque wrench isn't just a simple wrench. It's a precision instrument. It measures exactly how tight a bolt is. If a critical bolt is too loose, it vibrates out. If it's too tight, you can stretch it and it shears off under stress. It has to be perfect.
And Arthur knows this by feel. The new technicians are completely reliant on the digital prompt. The institutional memory, The unwritten, tacit knowledge passed down through generations of masters and apprentices has been severed because the masters were phased out for not fitting the new cultural mold.
Not for incompetence, but for not fitting the mold.
Right. As Arthur packs his toolbox for the last time, he sees a technician ignore a hairline fracture on a fuel line because it wasn't flagged by the automated, bias-free diagnostic software.
My God.
The systems become fragile, not because the machines are old, but because the human bridge to those machines has been replaced by a bridge to nowhere. When I see stories like Arthur's, I'm struck by the fragility of our modern world. It's easy to take our infrastructure for granted, to think that planes stay in the air and the lights stay on because of some inevitable momentum. But it's actually sustained by a very thin line of highly competent, obsessed individuals. While it's vital that we evolve our social values, this story serves as a haunting reminder that technical proficiency is not subjective. If we lose the objective standard excellence in our search for social engineering, we might find ourselves living in a world that is perfectly fair, but functionally broken.
Perfectly fair, but functionally broken. That phrase is just, it really stays with you.
Arthur represents the graybeards. Every high-stakes industry has them. They're often the grumpy old guys who know how the system really works because they were there when it was built.
In the HRO theory we talked about at the beginning, this is directly related to a key trait called deference to expertise. It means that in a crisis, you don't look at the person with the highest rank or the fanciest title on their business card. You look at the person with the most knowledge and experience. You look at Arthur. He has the authority, regardless of his position on the org chart.
But the story says the masters were phased out. Why would you get rid of your most experienced people?
Because in the new corporate culture, they are seen as cultural residuals. They might be difficult. They might tell a young manager with an MBA, no, that's a stupid idea and it's going to get people killed. They might use outdated language that HR finds problematic. In a culture that is obsessed with vibe and frictionless compliance, a character like Arthur is seen as a liability, not an asset. So you push him into early retirement.
And when Arthur walks out the door with his toolbox, he takes 30 years of intuition and unwritten knowledge with him.
He takes the preoccupation with failure with him. And notice that incredible detail about the technician ignoring the hairline fracture on the fuel line. Why? Because the software didn't flag it. That is a total loss of what HROs call mindfulness. The new technician trusts the automated system blindly. Arthur trusts his eyes and his experience.
It's a difference between a learning culture, which is always looking for problems, and a blame avoidance culture.
That's it exactly. The new technician is safe from blame. If the software didn't catch it, how could he be expected to? He can't get in trouble. But the plane is now deeply unsafe.
This all builds up to a political explosion, because by 2025, this tension between these two competing worldviews had become too big for the industry to contain. It went all the way to the White House.
Yes. We have to talk about the executive order signed by President Donald Trump on January 21, 2025. It was titled the Keeping Americans Safe in Aviation Executive Order.
It sounds like a direct and pointed response to everything we've just been discussing. What did the EO actually do?
It was a sledgehammer. The language was unambiguous. It mandated the immediate suspension of all diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives within the Department of Transportation, and crucially, the FAA.
So just a hard stop on all of it.
A complete and total hard stop. But it went further. It established capability, achievement, and dedication as the sole basis for any hiring and promotion decisions in safety-critical positions. It explicitly outlawed the use of any other factors.
And it ordered a review of current stats, right?
Yes. This was the most aggressive part. It ordered a complete performance review of all individuals currently holding those critical safety roles with the stated goal of identifying and replacing what the order bluntly termed incapable individuals.
That sounds less like a review and more like a purge.
It was absolutely designed as a purge of what the administration viewed as ideologically motivated hires, but the reaction from the corporate world, from the airlines, from the manufacturers has been incredibly complicated.
How so? I mean, an executive order is law. They have to follow it, don't they?
They do on paper. But what you're seeing is CEOs like Scott Kirby at United trying to pivot their language very carefully. You see them suddenly adopting merit-based phrasing in all their public statements to align with the EO. But internally, the machinery is still in place. The HR departments are still staffed by the very people who built the social impact dashboards and the identity matrices.
The workplace revolutionaries, as the Reddit thread called them.
Exactly. They aren't going to just dismantle their own work quietly. So the sources suggest that right now, in early 2026, we are witnessing a massive internal war inside these organizations. The legal mandate from the government says merit only, but the entrenched internal culture still says equity first. And the engineers and pilots are caught in the crossfire.
So where does this all leave us? We've traced the history from the Boeing merger through the 737 MAX disasters to the regulatory capture of the FAA. We've looked at the personal stories of Elias, Julian, and Arthur, which feel like parables for a much larger trend. It really does feel like we're watching a slow-motion car crash, but with airplanes.
We are at an inflection point. The sources, when you read them all together, collectively argue that the aviation industry is the canary in the coal mine for our entire technological society.
Why aviation specifically? Why does it break here first and not in, say, tech or media?
Because gravity is unforgiving and non-negotiable. In media, if you hire an incompetent writer, you get a bad article and people complain on the internet. In aviation, if you hire an incompetent pilot or an inattentive mechanic, you get a crater in a field. The feedback loop from reality is immediate, brutal, and violent. There's no hiding from it.
But the fear, the underlying warning in all this material is that this competence crisis isn't going to stop at the airport fence.
No. The argument is that it's metastasizing. We are seeing the same patterns, the same language, the same trade-offs being made in medicine, in power grid management, in nuclear oversight, all the places that function as the bedrock of our civilization.
If you have a surgeon who was fast-tracked into the operating room to meet a representative excellence goal and they freeze under pressure,
or a nuclear plant operator who ignores a pressure gauge warning because the diagnostic software, which they've been told is unbiased, didn't flag it. It's what some thinkers call the revenge of reality. You mentioned F.A. Hayek earlier. It's his concept of the pretense of knowledge. We cannot centrally plan and redesign complex reality-based systems according to an ideological blueprint without severe unintended consequences.
and the consequences are starting to arrive.
They are. The rivets popping off, the landing gear failing, the door plugs blowing out. These are the receipts coming due for a decade of trading physical reality for paper reality.
It's a frankly terrifying picture, but I think it's essential that we look at it clearly.
It clarifies the stakes. We as a society have to decide what we value more. The appearance of virtue on a spreadsheet, or the reality of competence that keeps the lights on and the planes in the air.
I want to wrap up with one final provocative thought that's pulled from our source material. It's really a challenge to everyone listening.
Let's hear it.
The rivets popping off a 737 are not an endpoint. They are a diagnostic. We must defend, without apology, that 2 + 2 = 4. We must insist, as a matter of civilizational survival, that the most qualified person full stop sits in the cockpit, operates on the brain, and designs the reactor core. This is not elitism. It is the non-negotiable prerequisite for a technological society that wishes to endure. The alternative is not a more just world, but a return to the dark one, preventable crash, one collapsed bridge, one grid failure at a time. The choice is between merit and ruin.